Hi everyone and welcome to Noise Busters. First, I want to say a big thanks to all those that have checked out all the previous episodes. The feedback's been great and we're really enjoying getting this information about everyone's kind of careers and slants on different topics within the industry. It's really exciting. So if you're new here, please do consider subscribing, liking and leaving a comment. So let's just check in with George to see if he's okay. How you doing, George?
I'm great. Hi, Dan. How's it going?
Yeah, not bad, mate. Yeah. Have you had a busy week? What have you been up to?
Well, I've been to London and back today. And now I'm enjoying a gin and tonic back in Liverpool.
Of course. Nice. Living at large. So,
What about you?
It's been quite a busy week. A few presentations, did a presentation on Friday, which went well, kind of an intro to noise, that sort of thing. So if anyone wants to check that out, it's on my LinkedIn profile, flying the flag for acoustics awareness. So just kind of building on this sort of stuff. So, it's all going well. Can't complain. Ready for the weekend. It's a long weekend this weekend with it being Canadian Thanksgiving. So we've got the Monday off this week.
Canadian Thanksgiving, is that different to the American Thanksgiving?
Yeah, it is. I think it's slightly different. It's nothing to do with the kind of war and stuff. It's more just a celebration of produce and the time of year of harvest and that sort of thing. Completely separate because theirs is in November, so it's a bit later on. So yeah, I'll have to have a veggie turkey or something. That's what I eat. Turkey or something, yeah. So yeah, in this episode, we'll be touching on various elements and talking to an underwater acoustics specialist. George and I are pleased to welcome to the show Justin Eickmeier. Hi, Justin. How you doing?
Hi, Dan. Hi, George. Doing pretty well.
Good stuff. So I'm just going to have a quick introduction to yourself, Justin, just so people know who you are and your background, and then we'll dive straight in. So prior to working in consultancy, Justin's area of research focused were really the collection and analysis of acoustical and ocean environmental data from the Arctic in the Beaufort Sea. During the Canadian Basin Acoustic Propagation Experiment, or CNAPE, Canopy, maybe potentially as short.
That's right, Canopy.
Yeah, Canopy. So his field research experience followed the completion of Bachelor of Science, Master of Science degrees in ocean engineering, at the Florida Institute of Technology. And then he headed to do a PhD in oceanography, where he started to specialize in hydrographic surveying, ocean instrumentation, and Justin has participated in numerous research cruises in the Arctic and elsewhere in the Atlantic and Pacific, which we're hopefully going to get into in this episode. His role on these projects has included designing, deploying, recovering, which is an interesting part, multi-sensor oceanographic moorings, undertaking acoustic monitoring using hydrophone arrays, and the analysis of acoustic data, which includes all sorts of things like marine mammal detection, ambient noise and processing, modelling of signals and deployed sources. Justin's background in oceanography, ocean engineering and instrumentation is complemented by substantial experience in underwater acoustics itself. Justin also works with underwater sound propagation, modelling and prediction, measurement, monitoring, data processing and all those things that go with that, including mitigation and control. So, Justin, that's a nice introduction. I think that we'll...
Thank you for that.
No, it's no problem. You sent it to me, so I did some tweaking. I work with Justin, so I know Justin a little bit, but I really don't know too much about his background. So it's really interesting for me to dig into how he got to where he is. And some of the people that watch the program are really interested in the stories of how people got to where they are, especially people that want to get into the industry. So I really want to know, how did you get into acoustics? What kind of started it off, and why did you even go there, Justin?
Well, I decided that when I was finished with high school, I was going to head off and do two things. I was going to study, number one, ocean engineering, and number two, I wanted to become a rower, crew. So there is a very limited number of educational institutions that will let you study ocean engineering and let you walk on tryout for their varsity rowing team. And one of those places was Florida Institute of Technology. So that's where I headed to study ocean engineering, and my interest in sound began when we started to look at wave theory. And I took a class on ocean instrumentation, and we started building some simple acoustic sensors. So after that, it was off to the races.
I mean, I've never heard anyone hear about wave theory and then go, "Oh, I need to do this." It's kind of someone who either has a musical background or that sort of thing. But it was really the technical aspect that really kind of made you interested in it.
Yeah, well, there's the transition from water wave theory to acoustic wave theory is they're not identical things, but they are related in the realm of physics. So it was a bit of a natural transition to from physical oceanography to the physics of underwater acoustics.
But did you always have an element of water? Was that always a big part of what you loved as a kid and wanting to kind of work in that area? What kind of sparked that for you?
It was when I was growing up. I spent a lot of time. I grew up in Toronto, so I did spend a lot of time out on Lake Ontario, and then occasional vacations to see the ocean and things like that. But when I headed off to start studying ocean engineering, was pretty open to the different fields that fall under that degree. It could be naval architecture, it could be port and harbor design, all different elements of coastal engineering and civil engineering stem from a lot of the topics covered under ocean engineering. And so acoustics was a very a subset, a specialized area of ocean engineering that I identified early on I was interested in.
It's so niche what you've gone into. I mean, that's the thing. I think Dan and I were discussing earlier is that this is a subject that we're really interested in because we just don't have any exposure to it, really. And I suppose what I was going to ask is about your PhD. What can you talk about your PhD specifically those aspects of it that related to acoustics?
Absolutely. So I've always tried to take a sort of three-pronged approach to my education and my degree, and even moving into my career, and that was to understand the theory, to study the theory of underwater acoustics. Number two, to be involved in the design and setup and calibration of the instruments that were going to take these measurements. And number three was actually being in the field to deploy and recover these instruments. So that kind of covered the entire gamut of ocean acoustics by nailing down the theory in the times that we weren't out deploying equipment or weren't on a research cruise, using that time to do research and run computer simulations. And then we would prepare for major experiments 2 or 3 months at a time. Can be prepared for packing equipment and ordering what you need to conduct the experiments. And then another 2 or 3 months usually out in the field to collect all that data again and see what you wanted to accomplish in next year's experiments.
Would you say that if you weren't particularly good out on the water, this isn't really a career path for you?
There is still a career path. It is a desktop career path. If the water's just not for you, you will spend most of your time in front of a computer running computer simulations, and there will be a bit of a disconnect from what's happening, what you're seeing on the computer screen and what actually went into obtaining those real world measurements and the care, attention, and planning that goes into the other half of studying anything in the acoustic world.
Tell us a little bit about the actual field work. I mean, it's not like the traditional field work, I'm guessing. I'm guessing you're out at sea for days at a time.
So it's pretty interesting. I can kind of describe a typical cruise to the Arctic.
Typical.
Yeah. Well, I think by the 4th or 5th time, I was calling it typical. I think my family and my wife were calling it typical by then too. But to go on one of these research cruises, you're working with either the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard in this case, or you're working with a pool of research vessels that are supported and supplied by various universities across the United States. That vessel, that ship time is extremely expensive. It can be $30,000 or more a day for that vessel, and that's just your flat day cost. It doesn't matter what you're doing on it. That's just how much it costs. So we would hire these vessels, these light icebreakers or medium icebreakers, for 30 to 45 days. Prior to that, you would have 2 or 3 months to ship everything you needed to Dutch Harbor, Alaska, or to Nome, Alaska, as that those are your 2 loading points. So everything had to be packed up in containers. Nothing could be airshipped because we were dealing with lots of lithium, large lithium batteries to power our undersea instrumentation. So everything has to go by ground months ahead of the time. And then when the week before the experiment, we all get on planes and take multiple flights until we arrive at Dutch Harbor and begin loading up the ship for a 30 or 45 day expedition.
I mean, anybody listening to this who's sort of thinking of moving into the world of work must be thinking, God, that sounds like a really interesting job. What advice would you give to somebody who wants to follow that sort of career path or work in underwater acoustics?
Well, what you already mentioned is finding out is if you have you're a taste for the sea, or if you're able to gain your sea legs, is not a bad place to start. But in general, I don't think it's like too different from other fields of acoustics or other fields of science. It has to be something that you're passionate about. That if you see, if you're the kind of person that sees an article in the newspaper that talks about quiet oceans or noise from commercial vessels, or a new study on ambient noise, if that sort of thing catches your attention and you're very interested about how humans are making impacts on the underwater noise soundscape and how the soundscape is changing and how marine mammals tie into that. If those are things that spark interest and creativity in you, and you have a desire for the STEM fields, there are many different avenues to enter ocean acoustics, from a biological perspective, a physics-based perspective, which is more of what I've done, from an entirely engineering, instrumentation design perspective. So there's many ways here to work in the field of underwater acoustics, and how you find your way is really, really based on what really you're most passionate about. So if it is marine mammals, then there is you would study bioacoustics. If it is the physics of underwater sound, you would study modeling and acoustic propagation theory. And if you're more interested in actually building hydrophones and new ocean instrumentation, you would have a stronger background in electrical engineering and computer engineering or software programming.
You've spent a lot of time out on long monitoring expeditions, you could almost call them,
yes,
out at sea. You described a little bit about the process, but like, what are the most memorable ones that you think, wow, that's going to stick with me, that was really interesting, or something happened on those trips? Like, can you reminisce a little bit about that?
When you start from Dutch Harbor, it's about a 7-day cruise up and over the northern tip of Alaska into the Canadian basin where we're studying. So it's a relatively easy intro to the cruise. You're not in any ice. You're just kind of cruising at the same speed. Everyone's making their preparations to get ready for when you arrive in the area. It's when you arrive in the area that all of the challenges of working in the Arctic start to come together, and your schedule goes out the windows. You can arrive in areas that satellite imagery showed no ice cover, on its last pass. And when you arrive with the vessel, there's actually 3 feet of ice, and that is where you had planned to deploy the equipment. So at that point, you're either breaking ice, which I like to describe the experience of breaking ice while being a scientist or a passenger on one of these research vessels as a slow motion car crash that's just occurring constantly around you. There's when a vessel hits ice, there's really no way to guess which particular way it's going to rebound or vibrate or even just bounce right back from it. So it's a rocky ride. And that definitely complicates things such as very delicate instrumentation, preparation, test, and calibration. And there are times where it's can't do anything about the weather, so the best you can do is strap yourself into the closest table, strap your equipment down, and get to work, and make sure you got your safety equipment on when it's time to go outside.
The first time it happened, did they kind of warn you? I imagine it was going to happen, and were you a bit like, almost like, what the hell's going on?
The first time it happened, we actually went in summer. This was 2015.
Okay, right. Yeah.
We went in the summer of 2015, expecting no ice. So we had actually taken a vessel from the university pool, and it was classified as an ice class or maybe even a light icebreaker. And when we got to the area, an enormous, I think it was 100 or 200 kilometers square area of ice had been released from farther north and drifted down into the experimental area and was not going anywhere. We had the ship for 3 or 4 weeks, and there's no adjustment or, hey, we'll come back next month. So the first year we took a light icebreaker into 3 to 4 feet of ice for about 3 weeks consistently. And some days we made forward progress. Other days I would wake up and take a look at the map, and we had actually were farther from our destination than we had when I had gone to sleep the night previously, just due to the movement of the ice pack itself.
Because I've been on like a trip up the kind of, the bit between, is it something straight between Van Island and the mainland, and kind of went up to Prince, the straight there, and saw wildlife and stuff. But you going further up, you must have seen some stuff on that trip.
Yes, on that particular trip, because the ice was so thick during the summer, had a very interesting polar bear encounter. If you'd like to hear about that.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
We don't get them here.
No. So we had worked our way into a rather dense pack of ice and kind of wedged the research vessel in, so it was semi-stable while we were doing some experiment prep and deployments. And the mess on the ship, they started to prepare lunch. I believe it was ribs they were making. This smells great. And apparently it smelled so great that it was able to attract a polar bear from over the horizon, because when we spotted it, it was just a dot on the horizon, and it crossed a couple ice packs, a couple open areas of water, and then began to approach the vessel. This particular research ship did not have a high freeboard, so I don't know, at certain places 3 to 4 feet up from water level, you could easily access the vessel. And the polar bear continued to come, hit about 200 feet away and stopped, kind of sized us up, and then continued to approach to about the 100-meter mark, stopped again, and continue to approach again. At this point, we can tell it's a very large, very healthy male polar bear, and was definitely not gaunt or out of place or uncomfortable. We were very much in his area, and as he continued to approach the ship, they had finally decided to sound the air horn, which did make the polar bear stop at around 50 to 75 feet away, and he did turn around and eventually run back off into the ice pack after that. But I have never been about 75 feet away from a polar bear without a zoo-style separation, separating myself from the animal. And in this case, it would have been about a 3 or 4 foot jump up to the deck of the ship. So it was an incredible experience. I've never seen anything like it on my return trips, even though I did see other polar bears. Nothing of the closeness of this encounter. And we took some wonderful pictures. The polar bear headed off to something that held his interest a little bit more than the smell of cooking ribs on a research ship. And great pictures, great video was taken, and that was actually considered one of the achievements of the cruise was getting such non-invasive pictures and video footage of polar bear.
That's incredible. Did you not consider giving him some ribs?
I learned later that had the ship's horn have not have caused the polar bear to change his mind, the next step would have been the locking of all the exterior doors. But the majority of us were gathered kind of on the bow of the ship, away from any exterior doors. And I don't know if we were closer to the doors that were going to be locked than the polar bear was when they hit the air horn. So. Good to remember where you are on a ship at all times in the Arctic, under any circumstances, but also when there are polar bears in the region.
No, it's really interesting. I mean, it's it's mad that this is a job.
Yeah, you're not wrong about that.
It sounds incredible. I mean, you get to see all these things, and just whilst you're doing your work, and go to places that other people can't go without a lot of expense, and you're able to work and do it as a career. It's fascinating, really. Are
you able to talk a bit about what the sort of common differences are between what you'd consider standard acoustics and underwater acoustics, given that not many people work in that field?
So acoustic levels in air are measured using decibels, and they're measured on that scale and using a reference level that's suitable to human hearing, to the range of sounds that the human ear is able to perceive. So when we look at underwater sound, not only are we no longer talking about human hearing, but we're also talking about a different reference environment. So underwater, we use a different reference pressure than we do for air acoustics. And so while we do get a similar sort of range of dB scales, a measurement of, say, 100 dBs underwater is not exactly equivalent to the same level measured in air. So there are some simple conversions that can be done. There's about a 63 dB difference in order to go from one standard to the other. But the most important sort of condition to remember in switching between air acoustics and underwater acoustics is the change in sound speed, and just how much more dense the medium is, how much higher the density of water is compared to air, the differences in sound speed, and then the differences in how acoustics travels underwater versus how it travels in air. Acoustics sound levels can take far more complex paths and have much more complex behavior when they are underwater compared to I won't say completely predictable, but relatively predictable environment involving air acoustics. So the environment plays a much larger role in qualifying your acoustic measurements underwater than they do when making measurements in air. It's very important to that all the appropriate metadata, temperature, salinity, pressure, depth, be included with any underwater sound measurements in order for it to be referenced properly in any type of report, or to be useful to anyone comparing levels from one site to another. And that's why there's an entirely different standard use for underwater noise than there is for airborne noise.
Does that mean, given the number of factors that having to be taken into account with regards to the medium, a bit similar to how vibration is a bit of a dark art in that, prediction is extremely difficult because you have to know a lot about the soil structure or the coupling. I'm guessing the level of uncertainty with underwater acoustics and its modelling is much greater than in air?
Yeah, it is, and it's because of sound speed, underwater sound speed's dependence on salinity, temperature, and pressure, and so you can have as you go down the water column, as you descend through depth, you can have different layers of salinity, a different salt content, layers of salt content in the water, as well as different temperature layers, and as you move from the surface to the seafloor. This can create variations in sound speed that would be much more complex than any natural variations you would see in air, and much more similar to the type of refraction effects that you see when you're entering acoustics enter a solid or a sediment.
You touched on a couple of points. Is that it's what people seem to know about underwater acoustics. One is that the sound power levels seem to stick out because they're so much higher than what you would do with normally, and also the propagation distances are enormous. Like, for instance, I've seen pictures of when they're proposing to do piling for offshore wind farms. We're talking kilometres, tens of kilometres, in terms of distance of interest. I mean, other than sort of piling, what sort of sources of underwater noise do you usually deal with?
So one of the greatest sources of low frequency noise, which is the noise that is able to travel substantial distances as long as the water column conditions are right. That low frequency noise comes from commercial vessels, from shipping traffic. So those same explosive or seismic charges, or sounds from pile driving or drilling that can be heard hundreds of kilometers away. These same low frequency noise that come from shipping, commercial vessels, cruise ships, even small vessels, they can also their low frequency emissions can also be heard significant distances from location of the source.
That sort of brings me on to the next thing, is in terms of receptors. So obviously, for airborne, we're usually looking at people, but I'm guessing you're looking at animals, not people in the water. But does that also adds a level of complexity, doesn't it? Given the, in terms of having to understand multiple species and their hearing methods, or
yes, it absolutely does, and that's why we have auditory weighting curves that we use for different groupings of marine mammals. So, for example, there is a different weighting curve that is applied for low frequency citations, such as humpback whales. We would apply a low frequency weighting when we are considering impacts on that species. If we're looking at a killer whale, an orca, that's classified as a mid-frequency. It falls under the mid-frequency citation category. So there's a different weighting curve, and that weighting curve helps us best understand the impacts of noise based on that marine mammal's particular hearing sensitivities at different frequencies.
Are you more interested in specific types of species than others?
Yeah, it all depends on the area. Wherever an impact assessment is requested, and there is a dire desire to see what the impact of a underwater noise event, vessel presence, marine construction, some other noise source, the weightings change based on the local the species that are local to the area. So if you have an area that say here in Vancouver where we have quite a few humpback whales and orcas, then we would be looking heavily at the low frequency and mid frequency weightings. However, for an entirely different area where we're dealing more with higher levels of dolphins and porpoises and other high frequency classified marine mammals, then the focus will be on those species. So in terms of interest for this area, for the west coast of Canada, the southern resident killer whales and their population numbers are of high interest, and they get a lot of media attention, and they are also the focus of several research programs in the area to monitor the population numbers and the impact that underwater sound may be having on them.
So you've had lots of time to work with port authorities, Justin, and you touched on it briefly about the kind of animals they might look at in terms of the impacts, but what would they look at in terms of the sources they include and what they might implement in practice? What in your experience is the focus of these things?
The focus for port authorities is typically a reduction in overall noise. A 3 dB target is used quite often, and that reduction has to do with shipping noise. That is going to be your main contributor to increased underwater noise levels, ship presence. So it is the goal of port authorities around the world. If they have a 3 dB reduction in mind, then that has to happen through management and mitigation involving commercial vessels.
Interesting. So, I mean, I think about this a lot. I noticed that there are still a lot of smaller, like leisure vessels, like jet skis and speedboats and those sorts of things. And they seem to me be much more irritating in air. But there's obviously a focus on the larger vessels because of this low frequency noise aspects. And I just wondered how this kind of equated. What is the reason for this, and how did the lighter vessel sound characteristics, how do they differ in water? What's the difference?
Well, a smaller vessel is putting significantly less propulsive power into the water, and there is a connection between the propulsive power and what's known as cavitation, or this formation and collapse of bubbles at the propeller, and that's quite noisy. So that process can happen on both a very large propeller that's on a commercial vessel that's rotating relatively slowly compared to, let's say, a small fishing boat, with a very small propeller spinning very quickly. That can also cause cavitation noise. So you can have contributions, very noisy contributions from both types of commercial vessels, and they're both contributing in their own different ways, from cavitation noise and vessel-related noises, and they aren't always in the same band, but it's the cumulative effect of noise from commercial vessels, noise overlapping from small recreational vessels, that's creating sort of a double masking effect over the same frequencies that are used by marine mammals.
But it depends on the species you're looking at then, I take it.
It does, yeah. Certain species definitely more vulnerable to high frequency noise, while others do more of their communication echolocation in the lower frequency bands. And large commercial vessels are identified and tracked through a system called AIS. And it's an automated identification system that transmits the position and basic metrics about the what the ship is and what kind of vessel it is, and this allows for management of commercial vessels and the routes they take and sometimes even their speeds. However, for the smaller recreational vessels, most of the time, this information is not being fed to the AIS system. So there is the knowledge about what small vessels are doing and their contributions to overall underwater noise levels is more nebulous, simply because their numbers are harder to track than the commercial vessels.
We've talked a little bit about assessment on mammals, but I wanted to know more about the kind of considerations when designing the measurement systems, the hydrophone arrays, etc. What would you sort of look at, and what are good pointers when you're designing those?
There are a couple of key considerations when you are deploying a hydrophone system. Some of the important ones that I've worked with lately are ensuring proper calibration of the system before it goes into the water, and then also either institute checks on the calibration or retrieval of the system after it's been in the water for 2 or 3 months. Calibration is very important, especially when you're monitoring multiple sites in the same soundscape. So it's very important that that one hydrophone not be set to a different sensitivity than another hydrophone, and that also things like system noise from power supplies or other types of acoustic sensors in the area, such as a ADCP, acoustic Doppler current profiler, aren't contaminating your own measurements. So what you put in the water has to be very sensitive. But at the same time, your measurement system itself also has to be very quiet. So it's not introducing any electrical noise into what are already very, very low noise measurements, especially when there aren't commercial vessels present and we're just trying to get an idea of what normal background noise levels or ambient levels sound like underwater.
So how big can these things get, Justin? The arrays, how wide can they span?
It can be as simple as a single autonomous hydrophone running on a battery in a pressure container. More complex arrays will use the same type of autonomous deployment with 8 or more hydrophones. This allows you to do some localization or finding the bearing to a certain source underwater. And this scales all the way up to large cabled billboard arrays that can be populated with 100 or more hydrophones for advanced underwater localization. So
interesting.
There is quite a scale on the equipment side of from just a single channel basic measurement to very enhanced signal processing techniques using many channels.
I have to say my takeaway from this, Justin, is that when you're doing assessment, the receptors to consider is area specific.
Yes.
The sensitivity of the receptor is species specific.
Yes.
There's uncertainty about the location of the actual receptor. There's uncertainty about the medium at which you're calculating your propagation in, and the sources that you're considering are dynamic and mobile as well. I mean, the question is, how does the assessment work? And ultimately, if there's a problem, what are your mitigation and management options? That's
a good question. And so one of the first things that's done is in the impact assessment is simulating the project. So we will model the project and determine which noise thresholds based on the project and the species that may be in the area, which thresholds should not be exceeded. And this essentially looks like a bird's eye view of a map, and it has contours on it that identify the range to certain sound thresholds. So these become exclusion areas where if a marine mammal is sighted within this area, then the operation needs to temporarily cease until the area is clear again. The second step from this is after you've modeled it, you can also, if it is an operation that is moving to many different locations relatively quickly, say a drilling operation that may be making 100 pilot holes or something like that, the acoustic monitoring equipment can be deployed locally to follow the job to its different drill sites, and then measurements can be monitored live on scene. And if a measurement shows that a certain threshold, a certain underwater noise level has been exceeded, then again, the operations would cease until it was permittable to resume operations and continue contributions to underwater noise levels.
So Justin, it's obviously a very evolving, ever-changing world, the underwater acoustics scene. How do you see the industry kind of changing, progressing, becoming more prevalent throughout the industry? What do you kind of see as the future? Within
the last 10 years, I've definitely seen awareness just in general media. When you turn on the TV or you go to your favorite internet news site, there is a lot more just general interest in what's happening with underwater noise. Are levels rising? What is the effect on different species? What's the impact of new projects that may be happening in your city at a port or harbor? Introduction of new vessels, all these things are happening that are going to make major changes in the underwater soundscape. Because right now we are working with mitigating noise from commercial vessels that are based on essentially old designs, except for a few vessels or a smaller number of vessels that have been built very, very recently. So there's limitations on how much mitigation can be done to an existing vessel design. There are energy savings devices that can help reduce excess vibration and other energy wastage or excesses due to production of noise and vibration. So these things can help reduce noise from commercial vessels, and there are always new technologies being introduced to help either attenuate underwater noise or direct it or baffle it. But real changes are really going to come from the introduction of new vessel classes and new propulsion methods. Vessels that operate in a hybrid configuration using diesel or other fuel source in combination with battery. And then eventually, when the technology catches up, looking at vessels that run for the vast majority of their time in battery-powered mode, and the implications to underwater noise levels that from a massive shift from a 100% basically diesel fuel propulsion system to one that is going to be handled the vast majority of the time by an electric cell system is going to dramatically change the maximum levels of underwater noise levels we see, and also the average levels of underwater noise levels that we see on a monthly basis. What this is unlikely to change, at least in the next 10 years, is this is probably going to have a very slow trickle down effect to recreational craft. It's similar to the shift of vehicles from all gasoline to all battery powered. It is there is a cost that has to be absorbed by making that very large initial first step to a new technology and moving away from one that has been relied on by shipping for basically since its transition from sail power. So it's exciting to start to see some new hybrid vessels arrive and running in hybrid modes in our waters, and that is something that it's expected to continue, and I'm personally looking forward to continuing as new vessel designs are introduced that have been designed specifically with acoustics and noise reduction at the forefront, instead of it being tacked on at the end with modifications after the ship has been built.
So where do you think the pressure's coming from? Is it the port authorities? Is it governments? Like, where is it coming from, and where does it need to come from, I guess?
For vessel owners, having vessels that are labeled as quiet vessels by the various class societies that operate around the world, it is an image that is being presented by the vessel owners, that they have a quiet vessel, that they've taken the time either in the design or the testing of the vessel to have it certified, and that looks really good all over for a ship owner, a shipping broker, or a shipping company to just have taken that extra additional step to consider the not just the cargo that their vessel carries, but also the impact that their vessel is making on the area where it's delivering and picking up its cargo.
That's really interesting and great to hear, because there's a lot of pressure on it, and it's nice to see that it's been taken as seriously as it needs to be, I guess. Great. I think it's time to just do a bit of a summary with the news that's come out. So I think, we normally crack a beer at this point, Justin, so I don't know if you've got one handy.
I don't have one handy. I have some coffee handy, though.
Coffee's good, yeah. George has already been drinking G&T the whole way through, so I'm catching up. We're drinking a hazy IPA microburst from Calgary. So it's...
Actually, Jonathan, I thought I'd talk about a news topic this time.
Okay,
I actually found one. I actually found that was pertinent to the discussion today.
Look at him go! Yeah, go on then, George. Take it away.
No, it was something I found on the BBC. Actually, it was from Matt McGrath on the BBC. I thought it was actually quite interesting. It probably Justin might be able to help me understand this a little bit. But it's basically they've found a way of, they've used the fact that sound travels faster in warm water. I'm sure Justin can confirm that is correct.
Yes.
And they found that to demonstrate that the Indian Ocean specifically is warming. And from what I understand, the reason why it isn't, whilst this phenomenon is well known, the reason why they haven't been able to use this to understand the warming of other oceans and seas is the fact that there's major concerns about introducing a really loud noise source just for the sake of working out if the sea's warming. So what they've done is they've used naturally occurring sound sources, which are earthquakes, which seems to be relatively regularly in the Indian Ocean, and the fact that they've got basically, it sounds like they've got shallower depths. They use argo something, which means they have got quite a good understanding of sound waves at those levels. But Diego Garcia, for some reason, they can understand the time it takes to travel from the point at which the earthquake to Diego Garcia. They've been measuring that constantly and determined that it's getting there faster than it would usually over the years, and therefore that ocean is warming. That is the terrible summary of what the findings are. But Justin, can you elaborate on that at all, and why in particular isn't it something that we're doing more globally? Why is it just specific to the Indian Ocean?
I believe what you're describing is what we call in underwater acoustics as the inverse problem. So there's a forward problem and an inverse problem. The forward problem is that you go out and you set up your source, receiver, and your instrumentation in between to measure the temperature, the sound speed, all the conditions of the water column. It's relatively straightforward to solve because you know your source, you know where your receiver is, and you've measured everything in between. In the inverse problem, you have a source and you have a receiver, and what you're trying to do is to define those conditions in between that caused the signal to be received at the hydrophone as you did. So in that problem, they're trying to determine how the environment changed the sound level based upon how it's been received. So they're using the information they know about the source, the information they know about how it was received, and what we know about how sound changes underwater to make what I'm sure is a very educated estimate of what the underwater sound speed, so temperature, salinity profile, looks like. And the alternative way to measure that would be to go and make a large number of point measurements and basically collect them in situ. So this is a way, and this inverse method is almost like a remote sensing method to extract information without actually measuring those conditions in the water.
That's just a question. What are these Argo floats? What do they look like?
I'm actually not 100% familiar with the Argo float. I can probably
they're like a big temperature
grab a quick
temperature
look
gauge
here.
thing, aren't they? I think.
I've just looked it up. To me, it looks like the maps of them looks like those maps that you got when after the tsunami, all the debris that was taken out to sea, and then they mapped where it all went, and they've had these big maps with dots flowing around the world. It looks a bit like that.
Yeah, they're a bit like a canister of CO2 or something, like a tall canister shape, but obviously have sensors at the top or something in them with a little antenna that communicates.
I see what's going on. Yeah, so it looks like it's a sensor system that is also linked to a real-time data reporting capability. It looks like by satellite.
Cool. And then the other article I want to share was some of you may remember that they had a fire at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. I visited there years and years ago, but they managed to save part of the organ by fire. But people are working on trying to make sure that the acoustics is correct as they start to regenerate and refurbish, trying to get it restored back to what it was. So they're starting to do models and kind of interpretive oralization of how it used to sound like, and then the plan is to restore and check that the acoustics are maintained and restored appropriately. So I don't know if this has happened too much in the past. It's kind of outside of my remit, the kind of whole restoration element. So I find it really interesting that acoustics is a bit of a focus in this kind of environment. I don't know. What do you think, guys?
Well, that's actually interesting. Most people may find this weird, but I've read 2 or 3 books on the building of churches and cathedral towers and their associated acoustics. I just happened to have read that. And it's very interesting trying to go back in and recreate and achieve the same sort of sound signature that, I guess has been around for as long as the original building has still been standing. And that's very complex, going back and trying to use archaeology to recreate noise.
They're even doing things like positioning, materials like curtains, rugs, and paintings, furniture that have varied over time. So I guess that the people that walk around it day to day would probably have a good idea of what was there, but just these little nuances that make a difference to the acoustics, as we all know.
Absolutely, yeah.
Really interesting.
Yeah, but there would be many, many, many little nuances in something that particular for the sound that someone would have designed for that style of building.
Thing is that they've actually started to look at streaming virtual reality 3D acoustic models as well over the web, so people can actually hear it, what they're working on. So I mean, it seems pretty forefront to me,
archaeological acoustics.
Yeah, I mean, have you ever thought about that, George, as a change of career?
I don't think I'd be much use, but I could do.
You could bring the tea and coffee and stuff.
Yeah. The gin.
The gin, you've always got some of that handy, yeah, that's for sure. But yeah, Justin, it's been fantastic to have you on and delve into more of your career history and how you got there and the stories about the polar bears, and it's been fascinating, genuinely fascinating. So really appreciate it. And if you want to reach out to Justin, he has a LinkedIn, so check him out, and all the information about him will be in the description on YouTube. So yeah, feel free to check that out. So without further ado, if you can subscribe, if you are new here and haven't already, that would be amazing. Drop a comment below to let us know if you have any future topics you want covering or anyone that wants to get involved. We really appreciate seeing those comments, and I know that this sort of stuff is creating a lot of value just to people that aren't in the industry and want to get involved, students or people that just want to move across. So it's amazing to delve into this, and I'm glad it's working. So, George, do you have anything to kind of close off with?
I'm just wondering whether it's possible to get into oceanography at the age of 36. I'm not quite sure. That's what I'm going to go away and look at.
It's never too late.
Never too late. Brilliant.
You don't really know him though, Justin.
I'm quite an old 36.
He's not aged well. But yeah, thanks so much, guys. Thanks, Justin. Really appreciate it again. And
Thank you.
yeah, we hope to see you in the next episode. Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Great show, guys. Thanks.